You're listening to the Tudors Dynasty podcast with Rebecca Larson.
I am so happy to be back behind this microphone to present my new season to you all. This season, if you've been following on social media, I'm doing things a little different than I normally do, and I'm doing a theme. So this season, every month, my theme is queens. And we're going to start out with a super fascinating queen, Henrietta Maria. So let's get to it. Let's learn about this amazing woman. Henrietta Maria was a French princess. She was born in the first decade of the 17th century and was the daughter of King Henry IV of France. So for those who are trying to connect the dots to England, this was after King James of Scotland became James I of England. So how are the two connected? Well, today I welcome back longtime friend of the show, Leanda de Lisle, to give us the story of Henrietta Maria. Leanda, welcome back.
It's lovely to be back. Thank you for asking me.
I am so excited to talk about Henrietta today, and there's so much territory to cover. So let's start from the beginning, but let's keep it brief because she has a fantastic story, and I want to make sure that we cover it all.
I'll try.
Well, let's begin with her childhood then. And as I had mentioned, she was the daughter of Henry IV of France, but she never knew her father, did she?
No, he was murdered. He was assassinated when she was 6 or 7 months old.
Is there any backstory you can give us on that to kind of give us an idea of maybe what her early childhood was like?
Yes, certainly. So he's remembered as Henry the Great of France, a great warrior king. He fought in the sort of wars of religion, Catholics versus Protestants in France. He actually represented the Protestant cause for a while. But as he was poised in victory, he converted to Catholicism because the majority of the French were Catholic. And he was reputed to have said that Paris was worth a mass. But anyway, he became a Catholic, and he then created a France where you could practice your religion freely if you were a Protestant or a Catholic. And he looked outwards, I suppose, like a lot of sort of great kings, and he saw the rival dynasty in Europe were the Habsburgs, who were also Catholics. But I suppose, having been a Protestant himself once, he was very happy to go into alliance with Protestant powers to defeat the Habsburgs, to become stronger than the Habsburgs. And not everyone liked this. There was a young Catholic fanatic, was in fact raving mad. But anyway, he was one of those who disapproved of Henry IV making an alliance with Protestant powers against the Catholic Habsburgs, and so stabbed him to death in his coach. Henrietta Maria's mother, Marie de Medici, Maria, she was called Henry after her father and Maria after her mother, so Henrietta Maria, became regent of France and was an extraordinary woman, very powerful figure, a woman ruling France, which had a Salic law, which meant no woman could inherit the throne. So it was very, it was quite sort of extraordinary what she was doing. And she was an extraordinary sort of powerful figure, Marie de Medici, and actually, it was shaped a lot of sort of French culture. So a lot of what we think about French culture, the French association with luxury goods and things, she, was sort of kick-started, you might say.
I think that was the perfect backstory for Henrietta's later life, because I think the more we talk today, the more the listeners are going to realize how important that part of her life was as well. So what was her childhood like after her father was assassinated? You mentioned that her mother became regent for her brother, but what kind of childhood did she have? Was she still raised like a French princess? Was she still educated the same?
Yes, she had really well. She had sort of, I suppose you could say, she had her education as we might think about it, but also, of course, she had what she saw going on around her. So one of her earliest memories would have been when her brother, age of 16, overthrew her mother's regency and murdered her mother's favorite, or had him assassinated. And the favorite's wife, who was her mother's sort of best friend, who used to do her hair every day, was burned at the stake. So she had some pretty sort of traumatic experiences. Her mother was put into internal exile, so she didn't see her for several years. Then her mother, who was a very extraordinary woman, then eventually managed to sort of wheedle herself back into her son's good books, and became very powerful again. On the terms of her education, her mother brought her up, I suppose, to know how to handle herself on the public stage. She learned to act and sing and talk on stage from a very early age, even to help sort of produce plays. And her mother very much felt that a woman had a right to a sort of public voice, and also to have a say, I suppose, in how countries were run, in power, that women had some right to power, because it was very much believed that women were the sort of heirs to Eve, and that Eve, was obviously evil, that she had seduced Adam in the Garden of Eden, and so had brought about the fall and had brought evil into the world, and women were viewed as kind of weak because they had been seduced by the devil in the Garden of Eden, and manipulative because they had seduced Adam into evil, and so forth. It's a rather unappealing story if you're a woman. And Marie de Medici very much sort of encouraged her daughters to think rather more about another biblical story, a different biblical story, which gave women a rather better press, which was the story of the redeemed Eve, the second Eve, who is the Virgin Mary, the mother of Christ. And she quoted philosophers who said that Christ, being, Mary's child, would obey Mary even, and so that women, and that had held power in heaven as the Queen of Heaven, and that women therefore, could have a place of honor and even hold power on earth. And I think that was important as well. You have to bear in mind that women were constantly told that we're sort of second best.
Right. So one of the things that I find interesting is that she was a princess of France. And even though her father was assassinated, her brother was the king of France, her mother was the regent. And so she was still an important political chess piece in Europe. Let's talk a little bit about her marriage negotiations, because as a princess, those usually start pretty early in life. How many connections did she have? I mean, her father was executed or assassinated so early on in her life. Did she only have one marriage match, or were there others that came about before him?
Well, she was the youngest. She was the last child of her parents. And so she had seen her two older sisters married before her. The first was married off as a young, in her early teens, to the heir to the King of Spain, the great Habsburg monarch, Philip IV, as he became. Then her sister, aged 13 and scarcely adolescent, was married to the heir to the Duke of Savoy, Prince Piedmont. These were all for dynastic reasons. Her mother actually wanted to have sort of peace in Europe, particularly between the Catholic powers, which is why she married her elder daughter to a Habsburg. And the next one was then married by Henrietta Maria's brother, in fact, into this Italian house, because they were the sort of buffer state, I suppose, between France and Habsburg Spain. And then it looked like Henrietta Maria might be married in France to one of the French princely families. And I think that's what she probably rather hoped. But her mother and brother decided that it would be useful for France if she was married to the heir to the crowns of England and Scotland, who was Prince Charles, the son of James VI and First.
And I am fascinated by this connection because at the time in England was more Protestant, was it not?
Yes, England was very Protestant. England was the leading Protestant power. But from Henrietta Maria's perspective, it was going to be essentially an alliance, because at the time there were tensions again between and indeed fighting going on. There were tensions between France, the Bourbon France, and Habsburg Spain, and Habsburgs in Central Europe as well. And so she saw this marriage in terms of her father's history of alliances with Protestants against the Habsburgs. She saw it in that light. And she also hoped that, and indeed her mother hoped, and the Pope hoped, that it might encourage the new King Charles, who was about to become king, or future King Charles. By the time she married him, he was king. Encourage him to stop persecuting Catholics, because they were also the British Crown were also the leading persecutors of Catholics in Europe, and it was quite a severe persecution. And so she hoped that that King Charles might introduce something similar to what her father had introduced in France, which was these things called the Edicts of Nantes, under which you could practice your religion freely if you were Catholic or a Protestant.
I think that's fascinating. So when they got married, she was rather young. I mean, by
15.
today, yeah, okay. So by today's standards, we would say young, but by the royal princess standards, 15 wasn't all that young, was it?
No, but it was. I think the point is what we think about, isn't it? Is, let's put it bluntly, is whether or not you're going to have sex when you're 15, with a grown-up man, with a grown male. So when her sister married in Spain, she was not obliged to consummate the marriage until she was, I think. This wasn't always the case. Sometimes they would do it earlier. I think the middle sister, Christine, in Savoy, did have to consummate her marriage at age 13, and Henrietta Maria had to do it at age 15. And I think she was probably quite physically an immature 15-year-old. So it's really slightly gross thinking about it, because she didn't become pregnant for several years, and I suspect this was because she wasn't physically mature enough to do so, which does sort of make one think,
Well, most definitely. And he was what, a decade older than she was?
Yeah, he was, exactly. So he was an adult of 25, yes.
Wow. So do we have any idea what they had in common, Charles and Henrietta Maria?
Well, I think, what they had in common, that's a very interesting question. Because they were so different in many ways. I think they both had a sense of humor. I think that probably helped. I think she had more of a sense of humor than he did, but he could be quite funny. So I think they shared a sense of humor. They were both naturally extremely affectionate and loving people. I think she was much more flamboyant and obviously warm and gay. She was by nature gay, one of her friends later said about her, whereas Charles was very shy, couldn't read people very easily, was very socially awkward, and she wasn't. But he was nevertheless very devoted to those he was close to, and so they had a great. So they both shared, I suppose, they were both warm people, loving people, and that obviously helped when the marriage started off extremely rocky, but they did fall in love and they became extremely devoted to each other. So I think they had that in common. Oh, and they also had, I suppose, they also both loved beauty and music. And although they had different tastes in art. Henrietta Maria liked modern art, and Charles preferred the old masters. But they both loved art. They loved music. They loved the theatre. Henrietta Maria enjoyed performing and talking on stage. Charles stopped her from doing that in the end, from talking, that is, on stage, because people in England complained about it. They didn't like seeing women talk on stage.
Of course.
Getting a bit uppity, dressing as men. Oh my God, very bad. Doing such things. So yes, they had those sort of things in common. And of course, they were both royal. Both had a very strong sense of who they were.
I love how you just briefly skimmed over their relationship was rocky at the beginning. I think we need to touch base on this a little bit more.
Yes.
For those who are unfamiliar, why would you say it was rocky?
Right. Okay. Well, so this poor girl arrives age 15 with these hopes. One of which, as I mentioned, she's hoping, first of all, that she's going to encourage good relations between England and France against the Habsburgs, and she's hoping that she's going to ease persecution of Catholics. So she arrives just when relations between England and France are collapsing, and people are blaming Charles's favourite, the Duke of Buckingham, his sort of best mate. Favourites are not really best friends of queens on the whole, because they see them as potential rivals for the king's ear. And so Buckingham's keen to blame things like the collapse of the French alliance on Henrietta Maria. And Charles wants to protect his favourite, who's being attacked in Parliament from these attacks, and to sort of please his MPs, who are quite, ferociously anti-Catholic on the whole, he continues and even increases the persecution of Catholics, which he had promised in the marriage negotiations to lessen. So she gets very annoyed about this. And also she insists on being, she is French. She's surrounded by all her French, ladies in waiting and sort of best friends and things. And they continue behaving in a very French way, which means they have a lovely time. They enjoy good conversations. They're not very formal. They just quite casual and enjoy having a good time. And Charles is very formal. He's formalized the English court. He likes things. He's got a bit of a poker up his bottom, the young Charles. And, so that upsets him and distresses him. And so they end up having furious rows. And of course, she is a teenager as well. You have to remember, she's 15 and she's a teenager in a way we might recognize. So she loses her temper in a very dramatic teenage way, saying that she wants to die, that he's so horrible, that she's going to die of misery and unhappiness unless she's allowed to go home. And they have an argument in bed one night when she says she wants him to make, her sort of French friends run her estates in England, and he says, perfectly fairly, no, she can't do that. She can only have English people running her English estates. And then she sort of completely loses her temper, and she sort of shouts at him that, her life is miserable and horrible, and everything is his fault. And I love that. I think to myself, gosh, I think teenagers have shouted out, it's all your fault, everything is your fault, you're horrible to me, everything's all your fault. He's completely sort of stunned by this. He can't believe that, his wife is talking to him, the King of England, and a divine right monarch like this. They do have some good humdingers. And he sends her household home, all her friends home, which she sort of, actually, she almost has a breakdown at that point, actually, because she's left almost entirely on her own without any of her friends. Suddenly her ladies in waiting are all these people she doesn't know or like. One of them is the mistress of the Duke of Buckingham, who she hates, and she's been told, and she's heard, that this woman who's called Lucy, Countess of Carlisle, that Buckingham wants to make her the king's mistress. And she's a grown woman and one of the most attractive women at court. What's she called? She's called a killing beauty, the killing beauty of the age, she's referred to as, this woman. And so obviously that's very distressing for this, young girl.
You had mentioned how upset Henrietta Maria was by her French household being released. Was there a letter? Do I understand correctly that Charles had written a letter to Henrietta Maria's brother and mother to inform them of what was happening?
Yes, he did, and he did. He described them as wild beasts, but not to the mother and brother. To the mother and brother, he said, which was true. He said, they're all going, but I'm sending them all home. And frankly, that her sisters lost their French households fairly soon after they arrived in Spain and in Savoy, so that shouldn't be any different for Henrietta Maria. And he had a perfectly good and reasonable point there. And everyone expected Henrietta Maria to calm down quite soon and sort of, get on with things. But she was always, as she used to admit, because she I suppose she had a sense of humor, but she did have a sense of humor about herself. She was always a bit of a sulker. And, even as a little girl, she admitted she didn't always find things easy to let go. So she did sulk for a good long time about it, until really she was told by the French ambassador that she needed to, make amends with Charles, which she then did, actually. It was shortly after that something very sinister happened. I think quite sinister happened when Buckingham was involved, in which it was sort of suggested that Henrietta Maria's lute teacher had said that he could seduce her with the power of his music. And this man was arrested for, as far as I remember, for a sort of attack on the rape of a child. And it was very reminiscent of what happened with Anne Boleyn, of course, in Henry VIII, when Anne Boleyn was accused of adultery with the musician Mark Smeaton. And it's not impossible that Buckingham was trying to tar Henrietta Maria in the same way. But by the time this had happened, she had worked sufficiently well on her marriage that that Charles was in love with her, whereas when it happened to Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII was falling out of love with Anne Boleyn, and Anne Boleyn had recently had a miscarriage, and it marked the beginning of the end for Anne Boleyn, who was executed not long afterwards. Whereas Henrietta Maria survived this incident, which isn't very well known, but which I describe in my book.
The Duke of Buckingham, George Villiers, he is so slimy. Every time I think of him, it reminds me of James the First and Sixth and Anne of Denmark and his relationship in that court as well. And that just kind of transferred to his son's court, didn't it? It's so weird.
Yes, I mean it was very interesting because it was a different relationship, slightly odd, slightly kind of Freudian in a way. So Buckingham was essentially James and Buckingham, although obviously one doesn't have photographic evidence of this, but they were basically having a sort of homosexual affair. James was a homosexual, bisexual, if you prefer, and was in love with Buckingham, who was extremely good-looking, very, very beautiful man. And this was obviously quite difficult for Charles, who was in his teens when his father fell in love with Buckingham. They didn't get on particularly well, but Buckingham then realized that, of course, James was going to die and Charles was going to become king. And he didn't want to end up like Marie de Medici's favorite, i.e. being assassinated on the orders of the new king. So he started sucking up to Charles. And Charles, who was a sort of lonely boy, and as I said, was rather socially awkward and so forth, suddenly found he had this incredibly sort of glamorous friend who was like a sort of big brother to him almost. And supported him, and he would support him in political things against his father as well, against James. So he is hence the sort of slightly sort of Freudian element. And so when James died, Buckingham was Charles's favorite. I mean, there was no sexual relationship between them. Charles was not homosexual, but there was this incredibly close friendship, which was sort of supercharged, you might say, by this background.
And then Henrietta Maria comes into the picture. And exactly. Of course, she then pulls some of the attention of the king, one would think.
Yes, exactly. Absolutely. And so Buckingham was concerned about this. And it's interesting that because Buckingham was hated for the power he held and ends up being assassinated. And it's often said, that Henrietta Maria then becomes powerful, very powerful, influential with Charles after Buckingham is assassinated. But actually, the truth is she had already become so. That's something I draw attention to in my book before Buckingham's assassination. But of course, she has no intimate rival after Buckingham's death.
So you had mentioned that Charles and Henrietta Maria's relationship improved. So let's touch base on that a little bit and maybe look at the number of children they had, because that's usually a pretty good indicator of a decent relationship. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, gosh. Well, they had many. Let me think. So they had a little Charles who died. Then they had Charles who became the future Charles II, Mary, James, Elizabeth, Catherine, and they had another one called Anne who died. So how many is that?
I wasn't counting. 5, 6.
Exactly. No, absolutely. Yes. So she did. She was very successful, and of course, the main task of a queen consort was to produce heirs, male heirs specifically, of course, and she produced and Henry, of course. So there was Henry. So there were how many sons who lived to adulthood? There were 3 sons who lived to adulthood.
And 2 became king, right?
Yes, and 2 became king, yeah.
Right. And then did they have a youngest daughter who was also named Henrietta?
Henrietta Anne, yes, her youngest, who was conceived during the middle of the Civil War. Hers is an extraordinary story as well. So she was conceived in the middle of the Civil War, when Henrietta Maria was in Oxford with Charles, and Henrietta Maria became his greatest and most effective supporter, I think, actually, during the Civil War. But she still had she still had become, she was still pregnant and had a baby. She had a baby when she was under siege in Exeter, and then she had to get back to France to help raise money and arms for her husband, whose situation was quite desperate. And she had to abandon and leave her baby in Exeter, which was awful. And I think one of the terrible things, if anyone who's listening who's had children themselves, is she describes how she has this terrible breast abscess when she arrives in France, which has to be sort of lanced, and it's very painful. And of course, if you don't breastfeed, you get these breasts become very sore and painful, and it must have been the pain must have been a constant reminder that she was a new mother, and she was in great distress about leaving her baby, with whom she was eventually reunited. Her baby was smuggled out later during the Civil War by a lady in waiting. So she brought her up in France, and became very, very close to her. And they were very close. She used to call her, the little me. She was a mini me. She was a mini Henrietta.
And even in portraits, you almost see that similarity too.
No, absolutely, absolutely. They were very close, and shared many interests, and yes, they were a devoted mother and daughter. It was a very sort of touching story, really.
Well, you've teased now about the Civil War, so now we have to go back a little bit and get to the point where that happens and where Henrietta has to flee. So for those who are unfamiliar with the Civil War, maybe you can just give a brief synopsis of what that was about, and when it happened, how did that affect the royal family?
Well, very unfairly, Henrietta Maria is often blamed for the Civil War. It's said she sort of turned Charles Catholic and that this triggered the Civil War. It's one of the things that is said, and that she somehow encouraged his authoritarianism, his belief in the divine right of kings. And it is odd how women are often blamed for the actions of their husband. I mean, you see it now with, say, Meghan Markle and Harry, Duke of Suffolk. And I don't know why people do this. I think maybe it's a whole Adam and Eve thing again, and Eve seducing Adam into evil. It's certainly true with Henrietta Maria. So just to sort of explain a bit, so Charles I believed in a divine right monarchy. He believed that God had made him king, and that ultimately he was above the law and that and Parliament. He believed this. He'd been taught this by his father. And it was essential, and it was also actually a very distinctly anti-Catholic form of divine right kingship, because he also believed, as his father had, that they were head of the Church of England and that the Pope had no authority. This being the case, he believed that all his subjects should worship as he did, and that meant his own particular brand of Protestantism, which was then known as Arminianism. So Catholics were persecuted throughout his reign, despite what people might believe or think. Henrietta Maria managed to ameliorate this a bit, so Catholic priests weren't executed for a period of years during their marriage, but they certainly couldn't just freely go have mass, for example, and had to pay fines if they didn't go to Protestant services. But equally, he expected his Protestant subjects to adhere to his particular brand of Protestantism. So Puritans, for example, who didn't hold with his Arminianism, which was quite kind of high church. Some of them went to America, for example, and they opposed him. And Charles quarreled with his parliaments about religion, but also about the Duke of Buckingham and the wars that he continued. He lost his wars against the French, against the Habsburgs, and he started ruling without parliament and would raise taxes without parliament. And then what broke the camel's back, what opened the gateways to the Civil War, was that he decided he was going to impose his Arminian brand of Protestantism through a new prayer book on the Scots. Now, the Scots were Presbyterians. They believed the same sort of things as the Puritans. They were Calvinists, purer form of Calvinism than the Church of England. And so they rebelled against him, and he was defeated. And so he had to have Parliament come back because he needed Parliament to raise taxes to buy the Scots off so they'd leave England, because Scotland and England, although they were united under the same crown, they were two different countries. They were independent nations under the same crown. They weren't the United Kingdom as we are now. And Parliament then started stripping him of power, and it became more and more ferocious and more and more. And the radicals began to take over, and they executed one of his leading ministers. And eventually the situation deteriorated to the point of civil war. Just before the Civil War broke out, Henrietta Maria went to Holland to take her daughter Mary, who had been married to the son of the Prince of Orange in Holland, ostensibly to accompany her daughter, but in fact she went to raise money, men and arms for her husband. At this stage, this was 1642, everyone expected Charles to lose the Civil War. Parliament, he'd already fled London. Parliament controlled London, which had the vast majority of England's wealth, power, and all that sort of area of England. So Parliament had the most men, the most money, the most arms, everything. And everyone assumed that Charles would be defeated in the first battle of the Civil War when it came. But Henrietta Maria managed to raise enormous amounts of munitions for Charles, which he sent back to England for him. And so he survived this first battle, the Battle of Edge Hill in 1642. And Parliament realized that she was extremely dangerous, and then made strong efforts, wanted to kill her, really. So she came back to England on a ship, bringing money, men and arms in 1643. And they pursued her through the high seas. She landed at a bay in Yorkshire, where the spies found her, knew where she was staying in this cottage on the quay, and their ships, when they entered the bay, bombarded the cottage. And there are vivid descriptions, which I use in my book, of her, playing the captain, she says, although a little small, she says, carrying her dog, her toy dog Mitty, under shell fire, bullets flying over her head, and with her ladies to a ditch, men being killed only yards from her. And she survives this, and she then travels to York, where she sits on the councils of war up there with Charles's leading general in the north. Charles is in Oxford, which is in the southwest of England, and she's very successful up there, and she almost helps Charles win the Civil War in 1643, but unfortunately, he insists she comes to Oxford, which she does, and when she gets there, he ignores her advice, which is to use the strong position he's in at that stage, thanks to her, to take London. London is fed up with the Civil War, and there are some riots going on in London. And she says, now's the time to take London. And he ignores her and besieges a provincial town called Gloucester instead. And, and the result is that the parliamentarians reinforce London, and he never gets an opportunity to take London again. And the Scots are, by this stage, are hoping to enter the Civil War on Parliament's side. And Henrietta Maria knows that when they do, the balance of power will tip against the king. The numbers will tip against the king, and the likelihood of him being able to win the Civil War is going to get pretty remote. And that's when she goes back to France.
There's such a human aspect to this. It's easy to say it all as fact, right? Centuries later, we can say these things happen. But when we think to that human aspect of it, I think there was a letter that she had written to Charles while he was in England to remind him to think of her, or something along those lines. Am I right?
Oh, yes. I mean, her letters are wonderful, actually. You really hear her voice. Because they're very they alternate between being very loving letters. I do all this for you. I haven't eaten. She describes being on the road for days, not having eaten, being very, very tired. But that everything she does, she's doing for him, and she hopes that it will help him. And she writes him also saying, please, when she's under siege in Exeter, she says to him, please don't send I know you'll want to send an army to rescue me, to save me because you love me, but please don't, because it'd be dangerous it'd be dangerous for the army, and it'd be better for me to die, or better for something bad to happen to me than for you to lose. And she's also very worried about being captured. She often says she's very worried about being captured. And for her, she says to her sister as well, Christine, she writes to in Italy, she's more worried about being captured than being killed, because she says if she's captured, the parliamentarians will blackmail Charles with my life, and he won't be able to stand up, or he might not be able to stand up to it. So yes, it is very human. And she also tells him off. She says, you made this, why are you doing this, or why have you done that sort of idiotic decision, or you must be tougher with this person, or please don't be so wimpy with that person. Yeah, so you very much hear her voice. So they are real people. And that's one of the things I really do hope that I bring across in my books. That's one of the things that I hope is one of the stronger elements of my book, is that you do feel these are human beings, and that I always try and describe not just what they've said in their letters, because they do express themselves very vividly. There's no need to make up what they're feeling. There's no need to say she thought this, or it's written down on the page, and so one can deploy that information, but also just know what they're wearing on a particular day, the sun is shining on a particular day. These things are all rooted in the sources, and I think it's very important when you read a book, when you read a biography, to feel you're meeting the person, and that they're a human being like you and I are human beings, living in extraordinary circumstances. But equally, I would say, although none of us are thankfully living in 17th century England, or indeed 17th century France, their experiences can resonate with us as well. Losing a child, for example, which Henrietta Maria does, and the sadness this brings. Some people have these terrible experiences now. Someone I know has recently lost a baby, which is so awful, I can barely believe it. But these things still happen. Losing a parent, as Henrietta Maria does, when Marie de Medici dies. Just all of the human things that happen to all of us, happy things, sad things, frightening things, the abuse, being abused, like some of the things that Henrietta Maria, she makes a joke of it at one point. She writes to Charles when she's in Holland. She says, oh, I'll pray for the man who married that popish brat of France, as the preachers say in London. She says it about herself. I mean, she's being trolled basically by people calling her that popish brat of France, accusing her of being an adulteress and slut and all these things. And people experience this too now, unfair slanders. And so I hope that also helps bring her to life, and you see her as a human being.
I'm so happy that you joined us today to discuss this amazing woman in history whom we haven't talked about before on this podcast. And I'm so happy that you were able to hopefully open the eyes to the world to who Henrietta Maria was, and that there is so much more outside of the Tudors that's equally as fascinating. And I would love it, Leanda, if you told people how they can get a hold of your book.
Yes, I'd be delighted to do that. You should be able to get it or order it at any good bookshop. It's available at Barnes and Noble, I know, and also on Amazon, of course. So anywhere like that, you should be able to get it. I don't know bookshops in the United States well, I'm afraid, but I think you should be able to order it from your local bookshop without any problem at all. It's published by Pegasus in the United States. And by Random House in the United Kingdom.
And this was really the tip of the iceberg today. So if you are interested in learning more about Henrietta Maria, I highly recommend that you go out and get Leanda's book. Leanda, thank you so much for joining us again today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Tudors Dynasty Podcast. You can follow and support the Tudors Dynasty Podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Patreon @Tudors Dynasty.